If there want them up, if there want them down, and so I'm staying here. I won't let go, even in a million years. If there want them up, if there want them down. My hope that I know you, my desire that I show you, gratitude that I owe you. Cause I was in that Cleaver's no-go until you came and dust off and revealed my spark. I was searching for the essence of existence, wanted to find you, but I didn't see an entrance. I came from a distance where everything was different. I called out to you and you showed me that you listened. From then we became best friends, and I gave my all to you, and you showed me who I am. I am staying by your side to bask in your light and your mercy I reside. I won't let go, even in a million years. If there when I'm up, if there when I'm down, and so I'm staying here. So I won't let go, even in a million years. If there when I'm up, if there when I'm down. Yeah, what is it I can give you? What is it I can live you? When everything is yours. Cause every time I walk straight, there's another door to help me achieve everything I need and more. Nothing more, nothing less than going to and fro, trying to hear that voice from heaven and your direction. I climb, but I fall flat like bread with no leaven. I won't let go, even in a million years. If there when I'm up, if there when I'm down, and so I'm staying here. So I won't let go. So even in a million years. If there when I'm up, if there when I'm down, and so I'm staying here.
I just couldn't bear to stop it. It's so beautiful. That song is A Million Years by Nissim Black. He performed it right here in our backyard. It's a recording of when he was a guest on AT Live with Moshe Storch playing guitars. I mean, it's beautiful. The recording is beautiful, and how much more when we heard it in person. In fact, we had a little audience in the backyard. A bunch of, kids and families from the neighborhood came to hear Nissim sing that. It seems like just another time. How are you, my holy sisters and brothers? It's great to see you. Let's light up the darkness. Who is going to be with us today on this very fine Wednesday? This is going to be a short-ish show, but packed with some really beautiful teachings. Bill Eldridge with us from Arkansas. Vaughn Billow from Fremont, Ohio. Melissa Eitel-Jurin, good evening from Great Neck, New York. Yosef Shum checking in from Boston. Lucy Ram Johnson, shalom from Minnesota. Ed Berg from Galloway, New Jersey. Hannah Rivka says shalom from Charlotte, North Carolina. Nancy Brundemel Wright from Southern Pines, North Carolina. Yosef likes Nissim Black. Donna Smith is with us from Bahama, North Carolina. Great to see you, Donna. Nancy Brundemel Wright says great music. Gwen Strong says Michigan is in the house, in the condo. Paula Schmidt-Klauser with us from Chicago. Harold Black, say Loretta, and Harold are with us from Roseburg, Oregon. That's not for us. Patrice Carter from St. George, Utah. Hannah Keller Southerns says shalom from Mississippi. And over on the YouTube side, nobody has commented yet. All right, let's get to it. Where are we holding? We are now opening a new Mishna. So we are on Daf Lamed Aleph. That's page 31 of Tractate Eruvin, the third volume of the Talmud. We're in chapter 3, and we're beginning our discussion of a new Mishnah. In fact, we're going to complete our discussion of Mishnah number 2, open and begin and end it, and then start our discussion of Mishnah number 3 of chapter 3. So let's get to it. Actually, let's get to it in 1 second. I didn't go live today with a shofar blast this morning. This is Elul, the last month of the Hebrew year, when we blast the shofar every day as we prepare for Rosh Hashanah. Today I heard a beautiful teaching. I read a beautiful teaching from Rivka Slonim. She's the education director from the Chabad Center at SUNY Binghamton out in New York. She writes regularly for our table for five. Every week we have 5 writers commenting on a verse from that week's Torah portion. So this is actually for next week. I just edited it. So this is a preview, right? No one else in the world is going to read this until next week. But Rivka had such a beautiful teaching. She said, all month I've been telling you, and everyone is supposed to do this, and it's what we focus on, that we're all going to be judged. We're going to come before the heavenly court. We're going to be judged on Rosh Hashanah. So this is a time to examine our deeds and see how we can do better, resolve to do better, begin the atonement process so that we'll sweeten the decree that each of us is going to receive for the coming year. But Rivka reminds us that what is Rosh Hashanah really about? It's about the kingship of the Lord, right? It's about making God sovereign in our lives. So yeah, we're going to be judged and we need to atone for our deeds. But the first thing we have to establish for ourselves before God is that God is primary in our lives, that we submit to the will of God, that we want to live up to the expectations of God, that we put God before us always. Rosh Hashanah is all about the sovereignty of God in our lives. So this is a time to focus on that and to really ask ourselves, have we made God sovereign in our lives? Do we find ourselves just going through the motions? Are we excited about having a relationship with God? Does it give us joy? You know, this coming high holiday period, Rosh Hashanah to Yom Kippur and then Sukkot, all of it, it's like celebrating the wedding between us and God. And you got to take a little time to enjoy it, right? I recently gave this advice. I met a guy on a golf course, a young guy, and he told me that he'd just gotten engaged very recently. I said, I'm going to give you the best advice I ever received about a wedding, and now I'm sharing it with you, right? So Nina and I took this advice. At your wedding, everybody gets caught up in all the people, the guests, and welcoming everybody and thanking them for coming and making sure you hang out with everybody at the wedding. And you get so busy, often the bride and groom don't even remember to eat at the wedding. But what the bride and groom really have to do, they got to take a moment at some point during that party and just kind of stand off to the side, not interacting with anybody else, just the bride and groom together, and look out over that room and take it in. Everybody came, everybody's joyful, everybody's celebrating. It's such a beautiful moment. Take that moment to look at it all and enjoy it. And likewise, as we approach this high holiday period, we have to make sure that God is sovereign in our lives, and we have to rejoice in that relationship. Thank God, as it were, that we have such a merciful and kind and fair and benevolent and mighty King in our lives. It should be a source of joy to us. And if we don't feel that joy, that's a good hint that we really need to connect with that sovereignty in our lives, to make God present in our lives so that we can call him our King. Let us blast the shofar for this day of Elul, the last month of the year, as we prepare for Rosh Hashanah. Okay, let's get into our page. As I said before, page 31 of Tractate Eruvin, the third volume of the Talmud, chapter 3, opening our discussion of the second Mishna of chapter 3. And by the way, if we're studying Torah, that's definitely one of the strong ways to make God's sovereignty present in our lives, right? We're studying God's word. Okay, so our sages teach one may establish an eruv, right? We've been talking, if you've been taking this class, you know what an eruv is, right? So we're establishing an eruv either to join courtyards together so we can carry throughout these courtyards on Shabbos, or an eruv techumen, so that we're joining boundaries so that we can walk further in one direction than we would have been allowed to walk otherwise, or creating a community eruv so that people can carry throughout a neighborhood or even a large area within a city that is surrounded by the side posts and cross beams. When we establish an eruv, as we've been talking about, we have to deposit a basket of food that contains 2 meals worth of food somewhere within that eruv. That symbolically, that is like our dwelling for Shabbos, all right? So we've been talking in the first Mishnah about, well, what kinds of foods can go into that basket and what are the minimum amounts of that food. Here in the second Mishnah, we're talking about the process of establishing that eruv, the process of depositing that basket of food in a certain place. Okay, and what types of food, not so much like literally what types of food. We saw that you could use eggs, you could use meat. There was a difference between raw meat, roasted meat, grain, etc., produce. Now we're talking about something different. Now we're talking about the status of that food, the ritual status of that food. So one may establish an eruv with demai. So demai is doubtfully tithed produce. In other words, produce that you purchased from a Jew that you have reason to believe that, probably because he's ignorant or some other reason, you have reason to believe that he might not have tithed the produce properly, right? So this is an agricultural community when people, they produced the products of the farm, whether it was grain or vegetables or whatever it was, and then they had an obligation, once the produce was all collected, to tithe it, right? And we still have that obligation to tithe from our income, but it originally comes from tithing on a farm. So the tithing process, just remember, and we're going to need to understand this for this Mishnah that we're studying, the tithing process was first the teruma gedola. So that was about 1/50th, about 2% of the produce set aside for the priest, for the Kohen. Then the next 10% of the produce is set aside for the Levite, right? Now, the Levites, there's much fewer priests. Everyone sets aside food for the priest, but it's a very small group of people. That's why the 2% suffices. The Levites are a whole tribe. I'm a Levite. So they get the next 10%. Why? Because they didn't get land in Israel. Instead, they got this tribute from the produce, and their job was to do the holy service, to serve the priests in the holy temple. And then that's the 2% for the priest, then 10% for the Levite. The Levite receives the Meiser Rishon. It's called the first tithe, the Meiser Rishon. And then the Levite, has to take 10% of what he has received and himself give to the priest. So that's also called teruma. And that's why the first teruma is called the teruma gedola, the big teruma. And then the second teruma is from the Levite that he gives. So he gives 1/10 of 1/10, right? So that's about 100th. The first teruma is a bigger teruma because it's about 1/50th of the original. And then comes the second tithe, the Meiser Sheni. And this is the tithe that we've talked about, that when you become a festival pilgrim, you go up to Jerusalem 3 times a year. This second tithe can only be used to buy food so that you enjoy your stay when you go to celebrate Passover or Shavuos or Sukkot up in Jerusalem, right? You go up as a festival pilgrim and you've got money in your pocket so that you can eat and have a good time and celebrate while you're in Jerusalem. Okay, so demai means that you're getting produce from a person who might not have set aside properly the teruma gedola for the priest, the first tithe for the Levite, and his own second tithe so that he can go up to Jerusalem, or in some years a tithe for the poor. That's demai. And we're saying we can establish an eruv with demai. We'll explain why momentarily. We can establish an eruv with Meiser Rishon, the first tithe, meaning it belongs to the Levite. It's been given to the Levite after its teruma has been removed. In other words, the Levite receives the tithe from people who give it to him, and then he has to tithe what he has received and give part to the priest. So after he removes the part for the priest, he can use what he has received in order to establish an eruv. The Meiser Sheni and consecrated articles that have been redeemed, right? So the second tithe, the part that is set aside so that you have what to enjoy when you go up to Jerusalem. Now you can actually take the food from your farm and eat it while you're in Jerusalem, or you can redeem it for money and then bind that money in your hand and go up to Jerusalem and spend the money. So what this Mishna is telling us is, well, after you redeem it for money, so you've got the money in hand that you're going to use to go up to Jerusalem and eat there, the second tithe that you use that you exchange for money, now that can be used either because you sold it to somebody and they're going to use it, or because you set it aside and now you exchanged it with your own money and you're going to take it up and now it's redeemed, so it can be used in an eruv. Likewise, consecrated articles that have been redeemed. So if you said, okay, I'm going to set aside, maybe this lamb to be that's a different case. But you're going to set aside some flour to use as an offering in the Holy Temple. So it's consecrated. And now you're saying, okay, well, this flour is no good for some reason, so I'm going to redeem it. I'm going to set aside the money that it's worth, plus 20% actually, and use that and give that money to the temple. So now the flour that's been redeemed, it can be used in an eruv. And Kohanim, the priests, may use challah, right? So challah bread, right? The bread that we eat on Friday nights when we celebrate Shabbos, it's called challah. But what challah actually means is that when people would make bread, when they would bake their bread for Shabbos, if they made enough of it, they would set aside a little portion for the priests, and that portion that's set aside from the dough that you're going to bake into your Shabbos bread, that's called challah. That's what the challah actually is. And so when the priest receives that bit of dough, it belongs to him, so he could use it to make an eruv. The Mishnah goes on and says, well, we may not make an eruv with. We may not make an eruv with tevel. So tevel is produce from the farm. Let's say if it's a wheat farm, like we've gathered a bunch of grain, and we haven't tithed it yet, right? We just established that you can use produce after you've tithed it. So tevel is before you've tithed it, so for sure you can't use it. Makes sense. Nor with Meiser Rishon, the first tithe, whose teruma has not been removed for the priest. So the first tithe that was given to the Levite, and the Levite hasn't tithed what he received to give to the priest. By the way, from this we learn that even a person in a community who receives charity from the community should set aside from the charity that he receives to give charity to others, right? It's definitely, sort of creating that flow, right? We firmly believe that no matter what we receive, we set 10% of it aside for tzedakah, for giving to righteous causes. Even a person who is supported by charity should set aside 10% to give to other charities. So it makes sense that the Levite who has received that tithe but hasn't set aside his own tenth to give to the priest, that produce cannot be used in the eruv. Nor Meiser Sheni, the second tithe, or the consecrated articles that have not been redeemed, right? So if they've been redeemed or tithed properly, it can be used in the eruv. If they haven't been tithed or redeemed properly, they cannot be used in the eruv. That's what the Mishna is teaching us. The Gemara starts by asking, demai? Doubtfully tithed produce, where we're not sure. We know that if it has not been tithed, we cannot use it. If it has been tithed, we can use it. Demai, by definition, is we have a doubt. We don't know if it's been tithed properly. And the law is that if it hasn't been tithed properly, we can't eat it. So if we can't eat it, how could we possibly use it in an eruv to establish a Shabbos dwelling for ourselves with a basket of food that serves as 2 meals for us? We're probably not going to eat it, but if we wanted to, we could, and that's how we shift our Shabbos dwelling to another place. How could we possibly use doubtfully tithed produce in our eruv? How? Well, it makes sense because we've learned in our journey that demai can be given to some people. Do you remember who can eat demai? We can give demai to the poor. We can give demai to impoverished people, and remember, it's not even mentioned here on this page, but we remember demai can be given to soldiers in a military encampment, right? Soldiers who are on a campaign, soldiers who have been sent by the government to fight, some war to defend Israel. We can give them demai. They've got enough problems, and it's a leniency of the sages that we can give doubtfully tithed produce to both the poor and to soldiers. So we've already had this principle. We saw that we can make an eruv with wine for a nazir, somebody who has vowed not to drink wine. Still, we can do it, and we can make an eruv with teruma that belongs to a priest for an Israel who can't eat that food. So what's the principle? As long as somebody can eat it, so then the eruv is a valid eruv. Interestingly, here on our daf, that's not the rationalization that's given. That's not what the sages say in this case. Here they say the reason you can use demai in an eruv is because you have the possibility of, even on Shabbos, declaring all of your property ownerless, right? You could actually give away all your property. You could also consecrate it to the temple. You could just make a decision that everything I own in this world, I'm going to give it, I'm going to donate it to the temple. One could do that. And if he actually did it, so then he would suddenly be completely impoverished. He would be one of the poor, and then he could eat the demai. So even though he hasn't done that, the fact that he could do that means that that demai could not only be fit for somebody else, it could even be fit for him, and therefore the eruv is a valid eruv. By the way, Rav Huna says, it says here on our daf, that Beis Shammai, the Academy of Shammai, the students of Shammai, ruled that we may not feed demai to the poor. And so maybe for the people who hold like Shammai, that's why they give this explanation that the owner could declare all his property ownerless. Well, no, and then he would be poor, and then he couldn't eat demai anyway. So it doesn't work. But Beis Hillel say that we may give demai to the poor. And of course, the halacha, the law, follows Beis Hillel, and this is in most things. And so that's why it's a valid eruv. Okay. Next, the Gemara says, it is obvious that we may not make an eruv with tevel, right? We just established that you can make an eruv with food with produce that has been tithed properly. Why does the second part of the Mishnah need to tell us that if it hasn't been tithed, that we may not use it in an eruv? We know that. We're not only not allowed to eat untithed produce, we're not even allowed to benefit from untithed produce. So why does the Mishnah feel the need to spell that out for us? Asks the Gemara. And the answer is because what we're talking about, produce from a farm that has not been tithed, that's tevel, untithed produce on a biblical level. There is such a thing as rabbinic tevel, produce awaiting the tithing process, awaiting to be tithed. What is rabbinic tevel? This would be food that was grown in pots that are not perforated. In other words, like if you grow vegetables in big pots and they don't have holes at the bottom, and I don't mean holes so that it can drain and it drains into some a big saucer that is underneath the big pot, but rather if it has holes in the bottom and then those holes are right over the ground itself so that roots could grow out of the pot and into the ground. If they do, then it's considered like these plants are growing in the ground. If there's holes in the pots and the roots can go out of those holes and into the ground, it's as if you grew it in the ground. But if you grow produce, vegetables, etc., in big pots that don't have holes that connect to the ground, then there is no obligation to tithe that produce on a biblical level. But there is an obligation on a rabbinic level. So what our Mishnah is telling us is even if you grow the produce in pots that don't have perforations that open up onto the ground, so you don't have a biblical obligation to tithe it, but you do have a rabbinic obligation to tithe it. And if you haven't tithed it, it's not a valid eruv. You can't use that food, that produce, to establish an eruv. Likewise, the Gemara says it's obvious that we can't establish an eruv with Meiser Sheni, the second tithe, which has not been redeemed, right? Like you set aside that second tithe. What's it for? It's for you to take that food up to Jerusalem and eat it while you're in Jerusalem. That's not very convenient to carry a sack of food over your shoulder on that long walk all the way to Jerusalem. And that's why you would redeem it for money and then take that money with you up to Jerusalem. But we know that. We know that you'd have to redeem it. If you haven't redeemed it, that you can't use that food to establish an eruv. So what is the Mishnah telling us? Ask the Gemara. Why do we need this obvious ruling? Why does it have to be spelled out for us? Answer, because you might not have redeemed it properly. You might have traded it for money. But if you traded it for unminted coins, is that interesting? Now you can really get this look into the ancient world. We would never think to trade something of value for coins that are not official coins of the government, right? Why would we ever do that? But back then, there was all different kinds of money. That's why money changers, it was an important job. They had to figure out what these different monies were worth from all different kinds of governments and lands and intersecting. I mean, still we have money changers in airports, but within the United States, it's not like there's really that many different kinds of cash being used. It's all American money, right? But back then, there was definitely money from all different parts of the world. I mean, the Holy Land has always been a great crossroads in the world. And among the different monies that were being used was just the weight of the metal, right? Like people would bring gold and silver or copper or whatever the metal was. It was real. It was pure. They weren't trying to be fake. But it was just that the weight of metal, of that precious metal. It wasn't a minted coin created by the government. And the sages teach that to redeem Meiser Sheni, to redeem the second tithe, in order to take that money up to Jerusalem, where the Torah says you shall bind the money in your hand. The Hebrew for that, to bind up the money in your hand, is vetzarta. And it must be money that has tsura. These words in Hebrew have the same root, vetzarta and tsura. And vetzarta means to bind up, and tsura means form. And so the sages are saying that the Torah is telling us that when you bind this money up in your hand to take to Jerusalem, it has to be money, real money, not just precious metal that has that weight. It has to be actual money printed by a government with the form of money, some kind of legal coins. And so if you traded it for metal rather than for legitimate coins, you haven't redeemed it properly, and the money and the food that you redeemed, therefore, is not to be used, cannot be used to establish an eruv. And that's our discussion of Mishnah number 2. Now we're going to open Mishnah number 3 of chapter 3. This discussion should be relatively quick. Well, relatively quick. So if you have questions, start putting them into the comments. All right. Mishnah 3 says, it is not a valid eruv if you send the food for the eruv in the hands of an unqualified agent. What is an unqualified agent? Right. So you're not going to walk to the place where you want the eruv to reside. You want to send the food there. You can do that. You can appoint another person as your agent to take the food from your hand and put it in the spot where you want your Shabbos dwelling to be. And then that person is going to go to that spot and he's going to say, this food is designated by so-and-so to be in this place as so-and-so's Shabbos dwelling, right? Your agent has to actually make that declaration. And then the eruv has been established. Normally you would do it, say, this is my dwelling, and you put the food there. But if for some reason you can't go over there, you appoint an agent to do it for you. This Mishnah is saying that you can appoint almost anybody to be your agent, but not everybody. There are some people who are not qualified to serve as your agent, and this is a general law of agency in the Talmud. And you have to understand that right now, this is not about modern concepts of inclusivity. This is just about legalities of 2,000 years ago, right? So this is the way they understood it 2,000 years ago. And what they said was, you cannot send your basket of food in the hands of a deaf mute, of a minor, of an imbecile, or someone who does not accept the principle of an eruv. right? So let's just break that down. Why a deaf mute? Like, we hate to hear that, right? I mean, somebody who's a deaf mute's got enough problems that they don't need to be, left out of certain classes of people who can serve as agents for other people. But in the ancient world, they certainly had a system of writing, but it's not like, they had like pads of paper and pen, which is how, for so long deaf mutes were communicating if they could learn how to write. They didn't have sign language. They had gestures and gesticulation, but they could never be sure if the deaf mute was, hearing or understanding exactly what the instruction was. And so the general principle of laws of agency in the ancient world, not today, but in the ancient world, was that you couldn't appoint a deaf mute to be your agent for this purpose. Likewise, an imbecile, somebody of limited understanding, so you're not sure if they got the message. A minor is a minor. I mean, you just have to be a legal adult in order to be able to do this. And then, very interesting, somebody who does not subscribe to the principle of the eruv. So who, and then the Gemara will ask, who is this? Who do these sages mean when they say a person who doesn't accept the concept of the eruv? So I'm going to give two examples. The first example is not written on the page, but it is actually included in a note, or maybe in my research that I saw elsewhere. But this would be like a very typical example. It would be what we call a Sadducee, right? So the Sadducees were as opposed to the Pharisees. The Sadducees were sort of a sect within the Jewish people at that time who did not subscribe to the authority of the sages, of the rabbis. Why? Because they only accepted the written Torah and not the oral Torah, the Torah shel peh, right? So in other words, we've always taught, you're studying Talmud here, so you're learning the oral tradition. And our tradition is, and this is just mainstream Judaism, that the Torah was given simultaneously the very, very condensed written form and the sort of greater instruction manual about how to understand the Torah, which was the oral tradition. And then the oral tradition has grown and grown and grown in every generation, not because the sages are like adding to it in the sense of adding laws, but rather trying to understand how we apply the 613 commandments that are spelled out in the written Torah and how they apply in our lives and in an ever-changing world. So these Sadducees thought that they knew better and they were only going to submit to the law, to the written law, and that's why they would actually sit in the dark on Shabbos, because they didn't have the commandment, the rabbinic commandment, to light candles before Shabbos began. They thought that they were supposed to sit in the dark, and in many ways they lived in the dark. And as you see, there's no Sadducees in the world today. Perhaps the firmest proof of all that they were on the wrong track, right? The Jewish people, here we are, 2,000 years later, doing what our sages have always taught us to do, and the Sadducees are gone from this world. There's another group of people who are understood as not submitting or not accepting eruv because they don't submit to the teachings of the sages. Who are these people? Here they're listed as a kuti, somebody who is a kuti. What is a kuti? K-U-T-I. So a kuti translated to English is a Cuthian. The Cuthians, very interesting. In the first temple period, right, after King Solomon died, his son was a infinitely less capable king than his father, so much so that the nation split in two. And remained divided, right? He was not able to, like Abraham Lincoln, unite the two halves, the northern kingdom and Judea. So then the northern kingdom had their king, and then Judea, the southern kingdom, had its king. And the southern kingdom is what we think of as Israel in the history of Israel. The northern kingdom, in a relatively short amount of time, just a few hundred years, was conquered by Assyria. And then the conquerors, the Assyrians, what they did is they deported all the Jews from the northern kingdom. This is why we say that they're the lost tribes of Israel. The 10 tribes of Israel located in the northern kingdom were deported from the land by the conquerors, the Assyrians. And now the land was vacant, right? The northern kingdom, which had been conquered, now was vacant of Jews. but it's still good farmland and towns and cities, and it's a country that should be productive. So what did the Assyrians do? They brought in a replacement people, right? They brought, and this was in the ancient world done all the time. In the Babylonian exile, right? When the southern kingdom fell, when the first temple fell, the Babylonians removed most of the Jews from the southern kingdom, and that's why we had the Babylonian exile. Eventually that ended and we came back. But the reason we're called Jews is because the southern kingdom was called Judea and we came back, but the northern kingdom was never restored. The Jews were never restored to that area. They were lost. The 10 tribes were lost. Who was put there in their place by the Assyrians? These other people, the Cuthians. Right? So the Cuthians were idolaters. They were idol worshippers. They were just brought in to farm the land, populate the town, send taxes to Assyria. What happened? God was unhappy that the Holy Land was being occupied by this other people who were idol worshippers. God is very not into idol worshippers. So what happened? God sent lions to kill the Cuthians. Like there was a plague of lions who would literally roam the streets and kill people. And the Cuthians realized that it was some kind of, divine anger being unleashed upon them for replacing the Jews in the Holy Land while the temple was standing, because the temple was still standing in Judea. And so what did they do? They said, well, obviously we can't worship idols anymore. We might as well join the religion, which is the religion of this land. And so they en masse converted to Judaism. But they didn't really. Their heart wasn't into it. They thought they were going to do that to save their lives. And just as we talked the other day about the Jews in Spain who were forced to convert to Christianity, and they became crypto-Jews who were practicing their Judaism in secret, these Cuthians were like crypto-idolaters. They were pretending to be Jewish, but they were still doing their idolatrous practices in secret. And eventually the sages became hip to that. In fact, later, when the second temple was being rebuilt, after the first temple fell, so the Cuthians felt like, okay, now we can just be ourselves. The Jews have lost. But then the Jews came back, and then they didn't want that second temple to be rebuilt, and they actively tried to undermine the building of the second temple. And so this is why the Jewish people, and the sages in particular, over time developed this distrust of the Cuthians. They eventually, once they became Jews, they didn't call themselves Cuthians anymore. I guess that was a name related to their idols. And they started calling themselves something different because they were occupying this part of Israel called Samaria. And so they started calling themselves Samaritans, right? So the Samaritans were sort of Jews on the surface, but they weren't Jews in their heart. And it showed. There was reason to be suspicious of them because their behavior proved that they hadn't really taken on Judaism as their religion. And over time, they just proved it again and again. And finally, the sages declared that Samaritans are not Jews. They're idol worshippers. By their behavior, they're the enemy of the Jews, and we distrust them. That's back then. I mean, there's something called Samaritans today. It's a very, very small sect, and it is not Jewish, even though their practice is similar to Judaism in some ways. But we're talking about 2,000 years ago. The sages already declared that the Samaritans were not Jews. And that is why there's distrust of Samaritans. There's a story that's well known. It has a Christian basis about a Jew who was robbed and beaten and left for dead, and nobody helped him. And then a Samaritan came along and helped him. And from that story, we have the phrase, which actually didn't start to be used until the 1600s, of the Good Samaritan. So the idea of the Good Samaritan is somebody who doesn't help other people for a reward. They just do it because it's the right thing to do. But the original story is that it was surprising that the Samaritan helped the Jew. Why was it surprising? Because the Samaritans and the Jews did not have a good relationship. And this is that history, right? So this is that history. And so based on that, you would not send a kuti, you would not send a Kuthian, you would not send a Samaritan as your agent to establish an eruv for you, because he doesn't hold by the eruv, right? He doesn't really hold by Judaism. It was just something he took on as a convenience at that point in history. If he proved himself and did like a proper conversion and was really living as a Jew, well, then he wouldn't be a Kuthian anymore, right? So it's people who are living in this non-Jewish way that are being referred to in this Mishnah. Okay. But, says the Mishnah, even if you sent your basket of food to the location where you want to designate as your Shabbos dwelling by an unqualified agent, a deaf mute or an imbecile or a minor or somebody who doesn't subscribe to the oral law, whether it's a Samaritan or a Sadducee, if you had a qualified agent at that location who would receive the food and place it in the spot and say, okay, this food belongs to so-and-so who's establishing his Sabbath dwelling here, then it is a valid eruv. It doesn't matter that the courier, as it were, who brought it over there was unqualified, as long as a qualified person received it and put it down in place. Okay, then the Gemara says, is it true that we can't send a minor? But Rav Huna teaches that a minor may collect food from the residents of a courtyard and establish an eruv for them. We have a specific teaching that a minor can collect food from the residents of a courtyard and establish an eruv for them. So then why is a minor on this list? Why can't a minor establish an eruv according to the Mishnah? And the answer is, according to Rashi, this is a different case. Because in terms of courtyards, right, Eruvin Chatzeros, the eruv to join the residents of courtyards together, it was a symbolic act that wasn't really necessary. Why? Because in most of these cities, the alleyways had already been joined in Eruvin. There was already larger eruvs in place. Why would you send a minor around, or why would you yourself go to the other houses in your courtyard to establish an eruv that wasn't necessary? Because it's a brotherly, neighborly act. It's a way of getting to know your neighbors. And it's a nice thing to do. And certainly a minor can do that because it doesn't really have legal significance. The eruv has already been established. Okay. And with regard to the one who's designated to receive, so you have a qualified agent who's going to receive the food that the unqualified person is going to carry to him. The Gemara asks, aren't we concerned that maybe the one who's unqualified will never take it to the person that you've established, that you've appointed to receive it? I mean, this person's unqualified after all. Maybe they don't want to help you, or they don't believe in what you're doing, or they're not capable of taking it over there. So what if he never receives it? What if it never gets to the place that it's supposed to go? And so the Gemara says, well, no, here we're actually talking about a case where you can see the place. You can see where you want to establish the eruv. It's way off in the distance, but you can see it. So you can see that your unqualified agent actually brought it to your qualified agent, and the food arrived in its place, and then you had somebody who was capable and qualified to receive it and place it there. The Gemara then asks, well, what if the qualified agent who's supposed to receive the food, what if for some reason he doesn't take it? He doesn't take it from your courier. I mean, you can't really see what happened at that great distance. You can see that your guy got there. Maybe the minor that you sent, maybe your kid got there, but you don't know if it really changed hands when it was at that location. And here we have a legal presumption that an agent fulfills his agency, right? You saw that your agent got there, and the one who's appointed to receive it is qualified. So why should you doubt that when your kid got there, he handed over the food, right? You appointed the kid to take it there, even though he's unqualified to create the eruv, because you had some confidence that he could fulfill the mission you gave to him. Likewise, you had reason to believe that the deaf mute or the imbecile or the Kuthian or the Sadducee would get your food over there, and that the qualified agent would receive it. Otherwise, why would you appoint him to do it? And that makes sense as a legal principle. If people appoint their agency, with the presumption, if somebody appoints an agent to do something for him, he had some reason to make that appointment. We're going to assume that the agency was fulfilled unless there's evidence to the contrary. But the legal presumption is your agent fulfilled his mission. All right, that's what I've got for us today. Let us examine your questions and comments. Yosef Shum says, I'm still a little confused of how food is used to demarcate an eruv. It's placed at some point within the eruv. Yes, exactly. The enclosure is something else, right? So and they're you're sort of joining us after something we've been talking about for a while. But in terms of the boundaries of the eruv, that's different, right? What we're saying is that the people who participate in the eruv, they have to either literally deposit food in this basket, or somebody was appointed to do it for them. In even a community eruv that serves as an eruv for hundreds or thousands of people, it's like all the people who make use of the eruv have, legally speaking, appointed somebody, like some rabbi in the community, to deposit some food. Usually it's matzah because it keeps for a long time in a place that is within the eruv. And so, and that is what, like, legally speaking, establishes the eruv, in addition to the boundary markers, the side posts and cross beams above. Or if it's an eruv techumen, where you're moving your Sabbath dwelling to another place because you can only walk 2,000 cubits away from your dwelling, and you want to go have Shabbos lunch at somebody who lives 3,000 cubits away. So you're going to move your dwelling somewhere between these two locations. And now you're going to lose the ability to walk that way because you can only walk 2,000 cubits away from your dwelling. You've moved your dwelling over that way, so you're going to lose distance from that direction, but you're going to gain it in that direction. In order to move your dwelling, you deposit that basket of food. So there's different rationales depending on what kind of eruv we're talking about, but all of the eruvin require a deposit of food within the bounds of the eruv. Sharon Frant Brooks, are modern day Karaites an extension of the Sadducees of old? There's some relationship. People will talk about that relationship, but it's changed quite a bit. So, it's sort of like descendants of, but not practicing in the same way or the same beliefs. I mean, I'm no expert on the Karaite religion. There's definitely a relationship, but it's not the same, and we don't have the same relationship with them now that we had then. They're not Jews. They have some relationship to the principles of the written Torah, but it's not a Torah per se. It's not exactly the same as the Torah. That's as much as I know. It's not something I'm an expert on at all. Charles Abraham Ramirez Verdugo, what do the sages say about the 10 tribes? Will they ever be found? Well, when the Messiah comes, yeah. Because then all the Jews will be gathered to the land, right? So everyone, so the way that Judaism establishes whether you're a Jew or not, it's one of two things. Either you had a Jewish mother, so if you're born to a Jewish mother, you're a Jew, no matter who your father is, or you join the Jewish people through a halachically, a legally valid conversion, and then you're a Jew. So everyone, who was born of a Jewish mother, even if she didn't know she's a Jew, because like somewhere along the line, these people were lost and they forgot that they're Jews, but the daughter of the daughter of the daughter of the daughter of the daughter, etc. This is a Jewish line, and then the children of those Jewish mothers are Jews, right? So eventually, when the Messiah comes and all the Jews are gathered into the Holy Land from all time, because there's going to be a resurrection of the dead as well. So all those Jews are going to, if they didn't know they were Jews, they're going to learn. They're going to all be gathered into the Holy Land. And by the way, since we're talking about millions of Jews over thousands of years, and Israel is a very small country, how's everybody going to fit there when the Messianic age comes? And we actually have teachings in the Talmud and in Kabbalah that the land, at that point, God's presence is going to be revealed throughout the world. It's going to be a time of open, revealed miracles. The real nature of reality in our world is going to be revealed. It's going to be a little bit like in the movie The Matrix, right? We're going to see how everything that seems solid and real is actually made of spiritual energy. And one of the results of that is that the land will expand to be as big as it needs to be to accommodate everybody who's going to be living in the Holy Land in the Messianic age. Carolyn Dobson Chavez, are the northern lost tribes the remnant? I'm not sure what you mean by the remnant, but I've been talking about the lost tribes, so hopefully that answered your question. And finally, Neil in Virginia says, in a community eruv like LA, are the public domains, the busy streets, converted to private domains so one could carry in those areas? I'm sure you addressed in prior lesson. I'm sorry this is a repeat teaching. Well, no, we haven't really talked about the laws of a modern community eruv. We alluded to it repeatedly, but we haven't gone through how that's established. And it's based certainly on all these teachings of the Talmud, but we haven't covered all of them. And they've had to really sharpen their understanding of how these teachings apply in a modern city. The bottom line is we can carry on Wilshire Boulevard. So somehow that truly public domain, where 600,000 people cross that street every day, so that's why it's truly a public domain, is included in the eruv. So presumably, there's form of doorway at either end, which is, a stronger conversion for public domain than just a side post or a crossbeam would be. But I don't know exactly how it's done. I do know that Wilshire Boulevard counts as that kind of public domain, and we can carry in it within the LA eruv. How exactly it's accomplished, I haven't studied it. Maybe one day we'll have somebody, maybe Rabbi Union from the people who administrate the LA eruv, come in and talk to us about it. I think that would be a really interesting show. All right, that's what I've got for us today. I think, we've all heard that term, the Good Samaritan, many times. Now we have a little bit of historical context, why it was worth saying, why was it worth noting that there was a Good Samaritan? Because most Samaritans were distrusted by the Jewish people 2,000 years ago, and here's why. And now we understand it a little better. That's just historical context. That just doesn't apply to people today. I mean, we don't have Samaritans today to even talk about. But now we understand the history of the term a little bit better. It's been great learning with you, and with God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow, Thursday. Man, Shabbos is almost here. It's Wednesday. We can certainly start saying good Shabbos to each other. All the best.